From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. This is the next hearing for the Section 1201 Anti-Circumvention Rulemaking. This is Class 2, which concerns audiovisual works and accessibility. We are trying, as with every hearing, to just sort of build out the record and ask probative questions. And for those who are new to participating in the panel, I will say a couple rules of the road. First is use the microphone when you are speaking. If you would like to speak, just tip your placard up and we'll call on you. And we have both a court reporter as well as an interpreter. So if either of them need any more information or would like us to, to do something different, we will follow their lead. So I think to start out, we will go around and just introduce all of ourselves, and then we'll start with a video. So my name is Reagan Smith. I'm Deputy General Counsel of the Copyright Office. And maybe start with Julie.
I'm Julie Saltman, Assistant General Counsel at the Copyright Office.
Kevin Amer, Senior Counsel in the Office of Policy and International Affairs at the Copyright Office.
Anna Chevet, Assistant General Counsel at the Copyright Office.
Jason Sloan, Attorney Advisor in the General Counsel's Office at the Copyright Office.
Stacy Cheney, Senior Attorney Advisor at NTIA, National Telecommunications and Information Administration.
If you would like to start, Mr. Schopert.
Yes, my name is John Shoppert. I'm a student attorney at the Colorado Law TLPC, and I represent the Association of Transcribers and Speech-to-Text Providers.
Blake Reed at the TLPC, and if I could ask for 30 seconds of the office's indulgence, I just wanted to, in my capacity on the ebook accessibility exemption, I wanted to acknowledge and thank the office for its conditional recommendation to renew that, but also for the work that you did to do the streamline process that avoided us having to rebuild the record from scratch. That was a major reduction in burden on some organizations that needed it. We wanted to acknowledge and appreciate that, as well as the provision of the live stream with captions. Thank you.
Great, that's good to hear.
Good morning, I'm Shannon Cowling, and past president, current board member of the Association of Transcribers and Speech-to-Text Providers.
Sophie Gallier, and I am also with the Colorado Technology Law and Policy Clinic, also representing the Association of Transcribers and Speech-to-Text Providers.
I'm Jonathan Band for the Library Copyright Alliance.
Okay, thanks. So two issues I forgot to remember to say is if you can keep a phone away from the microphone, it will prevent feedback issues, which we were having yesterday. And also, if you are called upon to speak, if you can just repeat your name, I think that is helpful to the court reporter. So I think now we will start with a demonstrative video, which we've labeled Exhibit 2A.
This tutorial will provide a quick overview on creating and adding captions to a video. There are a variety of programs used to caption videos, but for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to go ahead and use Movie Captioner. So you'll need to load your MP4 file video into the container. And Movie Captioner doesn't like that there's a space in my title, so I'll remove that space, save it to the desktop. And over here you can see that the commercial has been loaded. Down here you can change some of the elements. I'm going to change the font size of the captions to be 15. And then here it tells you that when you start to type into the program, you can listen to it, type, and then the video will repeat at about a 4-second interval. Since I'm a type-well transcriber, I went ahead and created a verbatim transcript ahead of time. I like to do that and then import the transcript. So here you can see how the captions will appear below the video. Some of these sentences are too long. They don't meet standards. So I am going to break them up a bit here. Do the same with this line. do that here. I think the rest of these will be okay. I'll fix this one. Okay, looks good. Now we're ready to do the synchronization of the time text aligned to the audio and video portion, and we'll do that by setting time codes. So when I hear the last word of the sentence, I'm going to hit the return key on the Mac. So we'll start to sync.
We're going to use an ordinary garden variety peach with its short, close fuzz and tender skin, and a regular regimental hairbrush with its rough, tough bristles, to prove to you that the man-sized Remington electric shaver will give you a close, comfortable shave, no matter how tender your skin, no matter how tough your beard. Look at this amazing demonstration. The Remington is so gentle that it can shave the short, close fuzz off a peach without harming its tender skin. And the Remington is so powerful that it can shave the bristles off a brush, bristles tougher than any beard. Remember the amazing demonstration of the peach and brush. For the close, comfortable shave you've always wanted, reach for
Okay, you can preview the video to make sure that that worked.
We're going to use an ordinary garden variety peach with its short, close fuzz and tender skin, and a regular regimental hairbrush with its rough, tough bristles.
So that looks good. Now we're going to export the time text file, the captioning file, and you can see that there are so many different types of files you can use depending on what player you're going to house the captioning video in. So I usually work in SRT files. So I'm going to export that to my desktop in the same format that I used for the video. Save that. I'm going to open up my VLC player.
We're going to use an ordinary...
And expand this here so you can see it. So here's my VLC player. I go over here to subtitles. I'm going to add the subtitle file. So now you can see the subtitle file has been added. So when I play the video,
We're going to use an ordinary garden variety peach with its short...
so you can see the subtitles are added. Now this is a very quick and concise demonstration of adding captions to a video. You can imagine the time it takes to create a transcript, to go through, to set the time codes, and then preview the video. And this was just a minute long. This tutorial will provide a quick overview on creating and adding captions to a video. There are a variety of programs used.
I think one thing I'll quickly preface this by saying just how Reagan said we're going to be trying to build out the record today. I'm just as with other panels asking questions kind of in buckets by different topics. But because of this demonstration video, I think we have a few questions about just the mechanics of how that works. So my first question is, I guess presumably circumvention was done before, or how I guess does circumvention, like what part of the process are we seeing in this video?
I'm pleased to tell you that we selected a public domain video, not under copyright, not encumbered with any digital rights management or technological protection measures. So this is a simulation of what it would look like to add captions once digital rights management would be removed from a video. Everything that you saw in this video would not be possible with a video that was encumbered with digital rights management. It would have broken at the process would have basically broken at the first step, if that makes sense.
Got it. So for purposes of the exemption, you would, if we were to go ahead and grant an exemption, circumvent and then use that MP3 file or whatever it would be to be loaded and to use the software.
That's correct.
Okay. So the text files that we saw, were those like hand typed? Are those generated by the software? Like how are those created?
So these are hand typed by humans. The program will allow you to type in to the program while you're listening to the audio, and it will loop so that you're able to catch the verbatim. Because I'm a transcriber, I chose to do a transcript prior because the workflow is just more efficient for me.
And are there any is software available on the market that could help with like transcription services that you could use in conjunction with a software like this? So I guess I don't know if this software is indicative of all softwares that you would use, and if it requires actually manually typing things out before using a software such as this.
In most circumstances, yes. Someone has to create the transcript, type the words, listen to the audio.
And I think like YouTube has like captioning services. Is that something that I just, if it can be used in some way to develop a transcript like this?
So YouTube has captioning services that can be invoked by the owner of a video that is posted on YouTube. They include the ability, and you could actually use this program to create transcripts for a YouTube video. The rub is that in general, the owner has to approve the captions being included in the file. So the trick is there's a lot of different ways to input and create the file that you saw. The trick is that there has to be a player that allows you to drop that file in and synchronize it with a video. So on YouTube, that's generally speaking not possible without the owner's permission. On a streaming service like take a Netflix or a Hulu, you obviously Netflix doesn't have an upload captions button. You can't. There's no way to make that work. With a DVD or a Blu-ray disc, there's again no way to get that file into the player. So the process here is you circumvent the video and get an digital rights management encumbered version of it, and then you can synchronize a new time text file with the player. And there's a few other methods of doing that, but that's the basic idea.
And then just like when we're talking about synchronization, so you're setting the time codes, and that's something that, again, always has to be done manually, or is that just with this particular software?
I would say manually, you have to set the time codes. With whatever captioning program that you're using, you have to go through the video, again, to set the time codes.
And it's worth acknowledging there are some experimental technologies out there, and I'm not sure if YouTube has added to their latest version, that look for silences and gaps in the dialogue and try to sort of intelligently assign time codes. I think those services are in the process of improving, but in general, the most accurate way is to have someone sit there and synchronize the time codes.
Have you used like Apple's, I guess it has a Final Cut Pro X, which is like a professional video editing software, which you can use to add captioning? Is that something that you have used before?
I have not. I'm familiar with the program, but you still need to have the container, and then you need to have a captioning file that you attach.
Can you remind me what was the name of this program in the demonstration?
Sure, this was Movie Captioner.
Okay, so when you used...
Yeah, I apologize. Could I speak quickly
Sure.
to the Final Cut Pro issue? So Apple just released an update last week, as I'm aware, that added a captioning workflow. It's actually fairly similar to this. It's just the preview of the video, the captioning workflow that you saw in Movie Captioner. Final Cut Pro would be an alternative to what you saw here. Doesn't bear on the question of circumvention or anything, but it would potentially be, and again, it's just released last week, so I don't think anyone's had a chance to really kick the tires on it, but it could potentially be used for this sort of thing.
So after using Movie Captioner, when you are exporting the file to whatever format you're going to play it in, can you remove the captioning to basically get a version as if you had not done the captioning, or is it layered together?
I'll leave to Shannon to correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think the idea is that in most cases, other than, there are a couple of methods where, so an MP4 file is actually a container that contains a video stream and audio stream. There are one or two methods out there where you can actually insert the captions into that container, but in general, the usual methodology, at least as we understand it, is what you saw here, which is that the video file and the captioning file file are separate files that are then combined in the player. So when, say, a student tees up the player knows that the caption file and the video file are there and have a relationship to each other, and basically multiplexes them on the screen, if that makes sense.
Okay, so would it be fair to say if you take a non-accessible advertisement or, a motion picture, you add the captioning features, when it goes to the player through the output, what you will have is simply the accessible version, I guess, right?
That's right.
Okay.
And when you basically have the end product, which is the accessible format, are any technological protection measures added to prevent someone else from kind of using it for maybe non-infringing purposes?
So that's up to the user to do that. I'll defer to Shannon you can speak to some examples of how this might be used. Different stories in different universities as to how this works out, or different libraries as to how that works out. But in general, the idea is to use a private distribution channel that is locked down, so only the student who needs to have access to the video can see it, usually password protected, that sort of thing. So this isn't generally a situation, the video doesn't go back on YouTube with captions, that kind of thing.
Right, it would go into
available
Cultura or Canopy, or are those the types of private distribution networks you're talking about?
Sure. So at Kent State University, we use Kaltura, Kaltura, and that program will allow you to add the time text, the captioning file. So you have the video player in Kaltura, and then you add that captioning file. And then we import into the courses via Blackboard Learn. So everything is password protected, including Kaltura.
Well, we're sticking on the technology. I don't know, Ms. Colling, if you're the one who would know, but how does this process differ from the audio description process? Are you using the same programs? Are there similar programs? What programs are you using if they're different?
The process overall is similar, and the difference is that rather than sitting there and creating a transcription, you're sitting there and creating basically an audio file that is then, as I understand it, added into the container. So you actually would add a separate audio file into the MP4 container, and then the user and the player can basically select, in the same way if you used on your television the Spanish language button, or if you see the SAP button, you see the secondary audio channel, you basically, or in various digital formats, it might have the English soundtrack or the French soundtrack or whatever. There's going to be another soundtrack that's going to pop up that is the audio described soundtrack, and it will overlay the audio description over the top. But the process of generating it, relatively similar, with the obvious differences that you have to sit there and create a script and describe what's happening on the screen. So you're not sitting there and verbatim, transcribing what's happening. A picture's worth 1,000 words. You got to make some more choices, but the process is more or less similar.
Okay, thanks. And then going back to my question earlier, if for the captioning version, you go from basically a non-accessible to an accessible version, that the player is going to automatically meld the files together and play it. And it sounds like in the audio descriptioning, you can choose accessible or non-accessible, or you can choose Spanish or so forth in terms of the output.
Correct. And then also with a program like Kaltura, you can turn the captions on and off, similar that you can do when you're at home watching TV.
And we should also add, there are FCC regulations that require all of these players to have the capability of both turning the captions on and off, turning the audio description on and off, as well as being able to adjust the size, the font, the color, the opacity, and various other features of the captions. There are some situations when it makes sense, as we did on the video today, to enable open captions where everyone sees the captions. They're essentially burned into the video. So that's the demonstration that you guys have today. We actually created captions for that and burn them onto the video. But in general, we want to include a text file with the video so that folks who are deafblind or have some sort of vision impairment or color blindness or something along those lines can adjust how the captions are presented. So most of the players will have a little kind of Microsoft Word style interface where you can change the font, change the color, change all this stuff.
So just a quick follow-up question about Kaltura, because you said you can turn the captioning off. So hypothetically, if a student, obviously you say has to have a password to be able to access the video, But hypothetically, someone could access it with a password, turn the captioning off, and then you're really just showing the original film in its original medium, I guess, right?
That's correct. So what we're doing is essentially going in and providing the accessible time text captioning file for those that need it.
And just to underscore it, I think it's probably the legal premise for that question. These are generally in educational contexts where we are making the assumption that a professor, for example, showing a video in class has the legal ability to demonstrate that video. So there's actually probably a whole bunch of other students in the class who are watching the video, perhaps on Kaltura, perhaps on another source. If, say, the video is originally on Netflix, originally on a DVD, whatever the case may be, other students in the class are going to be watching the video without the accessibility features necessarily enabled. But we are operating under the presumption that these are situations where that's going to be either a non-infringing use, either because it's a fair use or subject to the provisions of Section 110 or whatever the case may be. And I think the opponents raised some concern in their comment about, well, what if the professor is infringing in their distribution of the video? And that's, I think, we can discuss that scenario, but we're primarily concerned with scenarios where there's an otherwise non-infringing educational or related to something that's happening in a library use. So if that.
Thanks, that's actually very helpful. So just to clarify, so the end user presumably could be the student, like you're making it available to the student, or would you also make it available to like a faculty member so that if the class is all watching a movie together, that say someone who is hard of hearing can still watch along with the other members of the class?
That's correct.
And then we're going to talk a lot more about dissemination, but just since you talked about how basically Kaltura is used for people to access it. So I guess my question is essentially like a library being created within Kaltura. So if you go to the trouble of creating captioning for one motion picture, is that kind of stored in case some other student in the future needs that same film? Like, maybe we can get a little bit more into that later, but I think it would just be good to hear a little bit about it now.
That's a great question, and that's actually what disability specialists are grappling with. We have this captioning content, and there's research out there that captions benefit everyone, even our ESL learners. So it's really a discussion to be had on who stores that, who owns that. Currently at Kent State University, the caption versions are in my Kaltura account, but these are the things that we grapple with.
Would you say that's done on like an institution by institution basis? They have their own guidelines. Is it typical to have like written guidelines as to distribution or storage of these versions?
Yes.
And I just add there, this is a conversation that disability services folks are having with general counsel and assessing the fair use questions around, well, it would make sense if there's a curriculum that's being deployed at multiple schools and there's videos associated with it. It would make a lot of sense when you're thinking about the edicts of the ADA, which are to provide accessibility, but being mindful of the cost of doing that it doesn't really serve anybody's interest to recreate the caption file or redo the description. It would be nice to make those portable and accessible, but that's a decision that is, a university by university asserted decision.
Would you say that's sort of beyond the request for this exemption in that I saw like joint creators suggested, they said, is this going to be a publicly accessible database? And in terms of whether or not there's a database of the titles that are made accessible were this to be granted, I think a separate question of you're not seeking to sort of like put all of this publicly available. It would be sort of cabined by the disability services through fulfilling their legal duties. I don't know if that's sort of a vague question, but maybe you can speak to what would happen after.
So I think the answer to that at this point is that public database certainly doesn't exist. I think that's not going to exist tomorrow. Disability services folks, again, that's a conversation that folks are talking about. It would be nice to head in that direction. I'm not sure that this proceeding is the right context in which to flesh all of those issues out. it would be nice
What
if.
I'm trying to flesh out is
sorry.
you've said if this were granted, the accessible version would be like sort of conveyed along a private distribution network, and that seems at tension with a public database. I'm not sure what we're meaning when we're saying public database. That's just what I'm trying to understand.
So let me try and draw some contours. The one thing that absolutely nobody is going to be doing is distributing the video itself, right? So I imagine there's a concern that one university gets a video and then distributes the video across the country to every other university that wants to use it in a class. That's certainly not what's being contemplated. The question is about whether the time text file for captions or the audio description file for audio descriptions might be separately distributed. I don't think we have the record to say that technology is in the pipe and ready to go, and but for this exemption, we are ready to roll that out. On the other hand, it would be nice if the office were inclined to grant some breathing space in this exemption by not imposing super strict dictates on the dissemination of the caption file or the audio description file that might allow disability services offices to experiment with what that would look like. And we could talk about what the limitations you might put that on that are, that sort of thing. So I think it's something that folks are interested in exploring, but obviously the basic issue of being able to disseminate to students within the context of a single university, a single library, that's where we're at now. That's where the problem is now. So that's obviously the first priority and kind of what brought us in the door today.
So a quick question about that. So because the comments do reference litigation involving like universities like Harvard and MIT, but those cases involved information being given to the general public, not just necessarily to students. So just for clarification purposes, would it be reasonable for this exemption to really be focused on providing educational services for the students enrolled in a university, not necessarily anything to the public that the university might otherwise make available?
So let me try and tease that one apart a little bit because there's a few pieces. One, I want to make sure to give an opening for Mr. Band to talk about this in the context of libraries. Two, I think we've talked about faculty members, other employees of a university. So there are other internal contexts at a university in which disability service office might be leveraged to make content accessible. In terms of the public-facing materials that are on a university's website, which are often the subject of these lawsuits, so that might be live streams of conferences, along the lines of what we're doing today, might be promotional videos, that kind of thing. It's, to the best of my understanding, most of those videos are the university's intellectual property or a faculty member's intellectual property. So it's a fairly uncommon circumstance that the university is putting videos up on its site that are someone else's intellectual property. There are obviously some other just sort of baseline 106 issues around that. I suppose we could talk about massively open online courses and that sort of situation. That might be where these things intersect. But in general, the internal to the university situation is the primary context we're worried about. That, again, might go a little bit broader than students, might be faculty members, might be employees, and I think libraries are perhaps a different situation. But I think internal to the university is the primary concern.
Yes, Mr. Band.
So what I just wanted to add is that we have to remember that the kind of content that we're typically talking about here is not, Wonder Woman or Black Panther. I mean, a lot of, new content that is being released typically has, the closed captions and all that kind of stuff. What we're talking about is the stuff that doesn't have that. Okay, and so that's not, the current releases of studio. We're talking about older films, foreign films, some of these independent films. It's a very different universe. So that in terms of or documentaries that again are older documentaries that are specialized and are not sort of current releases that have all of these features built into them. Because as you can see, it's a lot of work. I mean. Our certainly from a library perspective, and I'm sure from a disability services office perspective, if it's available out there, if someone else has done it, that's much, especially the
So-
producer, that's what you want. I mean, you don't want to have to go to that effort.
So that raises a question I think we had, and I could see that the answer may have differing perspectives depending upon whether you're representing a library interest or an educational interest, but would it be reasonable to have some sort of a requirement to do a market check to see whether an accessible version is available before engaging in circumvention? That's similar to 108C, so maybe starting from Mr. Rand, if you had thoughts on that.
I would imagine, I'm not sure it's necessary to build that into the statute or into the exemption, because again, as a practical matter, you're going to be doing what is most efficient. But sometimes the market search is, if we're talking about just going on Amazon, that's one thing. But if we're talking about something more.
Well, I think I'm envisioning it similar to 108C as it already exists. I mean, it's a concept that has the advantage of already being a statutory concept for libraries.
So this is where, as a practical matter, would probably be not that burdensome, but it's more of a philosophical matter. And it's also the matter, that these, depending, and it's a cost issue, meaning if we already have a video, that's one thing, and then this would be requiring us to buy it again. Now, again, if it's at the right price, that's fine, because it would be so much cheaper to buy it if it's available than to have to do this whole process. On the other hand, it could be that the price that's being charged is a high price and so forth. So that's why the preference would be not to start putting more burdens into the exemption and sort of trust us to do what makes the most sense, because we're not going to be, running hog wild.
So just to follow up on your concern about, it being like too expensive if you go out into the marketplace to actually find an accessible version. So Section 108 already has, it's like it has to be a fair price. It's not, the burden is not to go find it at any cost. So would it be reasonable then to have some type, if libraries are already under the obligation to at least make a reasonable effort to find an alternative usable version at a fair price, why would it not be reasonable to have that same expectation in this context?
Well,
I think that we need to keep in mind, especially in disability service offices in the educational context, their capacity and their staff is already pretty limited. And I think to impose an additional obligation on those offices to essentially become experts in sourcing is not necessarily granting them the discretion or really within their scope of work that they should be doing. As the video demonstrated, this is already a very time-consuming process, and to put that additional burden is an unnecessary extra cost. Disability service offices in general, and I think this is to follow up what Jonathan Band was saying, they're going to be making the most economic decision. They'll be doing the decision that's the most cost effective, and if that is captioning, then it will be captioning. If it's finding a video that's easy on the market to find, then that's what they'll do. But one thing to put into perspective is that in university libraries, in just a few, my co-counsel and I went into just the CU library, and within like 30 minutes, we could pull off, like 40 videos that were not accessible. And that cost to go and resource those could be like potentially tremendous.
And just one other point to quickly add, there's also a timing issue, which is that sometimes, you need it the next day. And
that
would you
was
be able
part
to,
of why I wonder if the library need is different from the educational need.
No, but I think the educational need, I mean, the student might come in and say, or the faculty member might say, we need this, I'm showing this tomorrow, and we need to, and so depending, you might be able, in theory, to get it from somewhere on the market, but it might take, so that's why just added burdens, added hoops to jump through as a practical matter, could just put unnecessary burdens. We're going to be always doing what makes the most sense under the circumstances, and often that will be to buy the, to go out and buy it on the market. But just sometimes, for whatever reason, that might not be a viable alternative in the short, and so that's why, our preference would be not to have additional regulatory burdens, but
I guess, before Mr. Reed, I wonder if you could, welcome to augment on that, but perhaps when in your answer, if you could think about how the case law has also treated both the fair use provisions. I think the House report talks about the lack of an established market for accessible versions, and talking about this, Hattie Trust relies on that a bit in its decision, and I think that's why we're probing around that, plus with 108, whether the non-infringing basis is affected by the available of a fair and readily accessible version.
I would, if it's okay. Sorry, this is Blake Reed. I'd like to augment this point, but we would love to spend some time on the fair use point, and I know Mr. Shoppard has got something to add here as well. I think for both the library and educational context, we need to step back a second and think about the record of what we're talking about. The scenario is there is an accessible version of a work and an inaccessible version of that same work, and the institution has the inaccessible one. As a practical matter, that first cut is going to filter out almost every video in the market. Either there's going to be an accessible version or it isn't. The scenarios where something is created without captions, or especially without descriptions in the first instance, and then later, for some reason, somebody has the legal mandate to come in and add captions or add descriptions to it. The number of works on the market that qualify for that are minuscule. So I think it's important to understand that we're talking about a very, very hypothetical scenario. Then within that very hypothetical scenario, we are talking about a situation where the library or the professor who comes to disability services, or whatever the scenario is, has the inaccessible version and not the accessible version. So we're talking about a very tiny little fraction of situations where this is actually going to apply. So I think you have to think about that burden of saying, okay, in the hypothetical situation, and I don't think there's anything in opponents' comments that suggests a particular example where this is the case. The hypothetical scenario where this might occur, we are going to force an under-resourced disability services office or an under-resourced library to go through and do a market search for something that is in all likelihood not going to be there. That's the kind of burden that we're worried about. It's not just that going and doing that search is burdensome, but it's almost always going to fail. There's almost always not going to be anything out here. Here's another important wrinkle for you to think about. Getting back to the question of dissemination, which is, so now when we think about the market search, what about situations where another university has captioned the video? Does that need to become part of the ambit of the search? Are universities then allowed to disseminate the video? So I think you have to think about where you might have other universities captioning an old video. Does that suddenly need to become part of the ambit of the search? And then I think you need to think about how that factors into limitations that you place on dissemination. So in other words, does Ms. Cowling have to go to other universities and say, hey, has anybody else captioned this already? Do you have an accessible version of this? If so, you might draw this exemption in a way that would actually require her to go get it from them. I'm not sure that is what you want to come up with. So I think the hypothetical scenarios are weigh pretty strongly in favor of not including any kind of commercial availability search in this context. And I think Mr. Shoppard had one more thing to add on that.
Yes. In addition to my colleagues' concerns about costs, I think it's important to kind of practically think about how these would play out in the classroom. If you put yourself in the position of somebody who is deaf or hard of hearing, it's going to take longer for the disability services offices to go and get an accessible version. This could be days or weeks of them not being able to participate in class, whereas under this exemption, disability services professionals would be able to timely circumvent and make that version accessible, which is really what we're concerned with.
And I guess please interrupt if this isn't where you want us to go, but I'm happy to tee into the market issues if that's
Sure,
helpful.
go ahead.
So obviously, HathiTrust created sort of a new branch of the first factor analysis, and that's worth talking about as well. But the keystone of the analysis, and also of the legislative history of the '76 Act, and as referenced in Sony, focuses on the market harm, and in these accessibility contexts, and actually commend your attention to the legislative history of the '96 Telecom Act and other places where Congress has explicitly acknowledged there is a market failure in the provision of accessible services. So that's an important backdrop to all of this, and this is an exemption unlike some of the others that you have heard this week, where we would love to see a market for this stuff. And I think I said to the panel last time around, when we did the ebook accessibility exemption, we would love to not come back in 3 years because it turns out that all of this stuff is being provided with captions and description. Ms. Cowling and her colleagues are very busy and have lots of other challenges to deal with, and if that is obviated by the copyright holders and providers of these videos inherently, that's a win. So copyright exemptions and the ability to circumvent are not necessarily the only way to solve this problem. We are here because that is the least worst solution to deal with the way things are now. And this is not a hypothetical problem. So I think we referenced in our comments, there are disability services providers with dozens or hundreds of requests a semester in this regard. And so whatever the market should be doing, ought to be doing, the reality is that it's not. And on a regular basis, a video shows up in a disability services office and somebody has to deal with captioning it to make sure that a student with a disability is afforded their equal rights to it. So I think this is an area where there's just not any real dispute that the market is serving that function. And again, I think to the point about commercial availability, if the commercially available work is out there, the likelihood is that the professor finds it, the library finds it and already has that, and it never shows up in a disability services office in the first place.
Yeah, I think we're just still trying to balance, because as Mr. Ban said, you're really going after the ones that are in an inaccessible format. There is no accessible format available, but I think we're also mindful, just what we were talking about, HathiTrust was dealing with a situation where there was not a market, but it sounds like at least for captioning and to some extent audio description, there is a little bit of a market, maybe not the huge market that you want. So, how do we balance where there are, like for television, like the FCC has certain rules, like any television program most of the time has to be captioned. There are some exceptions. It's usually like English and Spanish, if it's in Korean, maybe it's not. But so when you have rules like that, or you see Netflix was sued, is now providing captioning, now provides audio description, maybe not for all of its offerings, but for a lot. And perhaps Hulu will after, we'll see how the case settles out with Hulu. So what are we to do in a situation where, to kind of carve out here, well, maybe it's not imposing a burden to go look in the marketplace, but then how do we balance that with the content providers where they have made a market of providing accessible formats, but those are not being used for the purposes that you seek here?
So I dispute the characterization of the captions and descriptions that are created for compliance with the FCC's rules as a market. That is I understand a market to be economic activity that occurs absent government intervention. And it's well documented. There's a great book about this by a woman named Karen Strauss that does a historical documentation of captioning up until the 1990s when Congress started to intervene. And it's basically non-existent. And this is all technology that is not that complicated and has been around in principle since the 1930s
well,
and 1940s.
what about, but the FCC also regards if it was captioned on television in the initial broadcast, that if it's restreamed, like on the internet, that it also has to include captioning. So when you're seeing like reruns of shows, so like isn't there a market for like internet streaming services for that, which
Sure.
is aside from when it was initially broadcast?
Yeah, I mean, I try and cut to the chase here, which is we try to focus this exemption and in our initial comments, and I'm happy to elaborate here, on areas where the FCC's rules don't cover. So if the FCC's rules lead to a program being captioned, and they do in a lot of cases, that's not the kind of thing that we're talking about within the ambit of this exemption. So if it's helpful to note that in the exemption, for example, that it doesn't cover situations where the program is already captioned or the program is already described, nobody in a disability services office is particularly interested in recaptioning or redescribing a program. That's never a scenario where someone
But we've also had, I've heard said today that we don't want to have, or I should say you have mentioned not wanting to have some type of obligation to go look in the marketplace to see if it's accessible or not. So I'm trying to, to understand to where we can kind of draw the line where I don't know, if you know that it's captioned, do you have to go and look out? How do we balance that?
So this is what I'm trying to get across is you're envisioning a scenario where there is a video that's sitting in a library or somehow gets in the door at a disability services office and it doesn't have captions, and there's another version out on the marketplace that does have captions. And there is very little reason for that ever to happen. The scenarios and where that happen are entirely hypothetical and frankly kind of hard to envision and not documented anywhere in the record. And again, the point is, what do you want people to go look for? If a video comes in on DVD, where do they have to go scour to look for the captions? Do they have to scour all of the streaming services? The likelihood, if it's not captioned on DVD, that it's going to be captioned on some streaming service, pretty low. It's not going to be there. Yeah.
I have a slightly related question to that. So in the example you gave, an inaccessible version comes in the door to the Disability Services Organization, and in the current eBooks accessibility version, it requires that a copy is lawfully obtained by the circumventing activity. Is that a requirement that you think would be appropriate to build into this exemption? So maybe you obtain the inaccessible version, this is why you need to circumvent it.
So I'm guessing Mr. Band would like to get on this point as well. Again, to the point I raised at the beginning, we are presuming this is a scenario where a professor or a faculty member, employee of the university, someone has lawful access to this work. Now, they may not have lawfully obtained a copy. They may have access through a streaming service or something like that. But the point is, there is a scenario where a university employee or a student at the university has a lawful opportunity to be showing this video for a lawful purpose. So I'm a little anxious about the idea of lawfully obtaining a copy.
You don't
but
stream an ebook, so that may be part of why the language is different in that exemption.
But in principle, I think a limitation that says the intake and the output from the Disability Services Office all has to be non-infringing, has to be lawful. I don't think we're envisioning any scenarios where this is, well, in fact, I can promise you we are not envisioning any scenarios where this is a backdoor for piracy or whatever else the opponents might be concerned about. If there's anything we can do to ameliorate that concern.
No, I think that's what Ms. Smith was referring to, is just wanting to make sure we're not talking about a university getting a bootleg version and then doing that. So I think with, when we're talking about putting the lawfully acquired language, it would speak to situations to prevent that from specific scenario.
And the only other thing I'd add is the educational fair use context and the intake of videos from professors, students, et cetera, is fairly complicated, right? And there are some fairly complicated questions. I'd urge the office to avoid importing that entire mess of law into this exemption. The situation when a disability services office gets a request is they might need to put this together in very short order, like tomorrow or the next day, to make sure that a student can get access for it. So I wouldn't want to put the burden on a disability services office to do a lengthy upstream inquiry about the acquisition of the video. I think
we're just saying you've got the copy. This in the same way in a non-accessible version, you've gotten the copy through authorization or streamed it with permission. It comes in legitimate the same way it would come in a non-accessible way, legitimate.
And this is not an effort to expand the scope of permissible uses or permissible circumvention of folks upstream from a disability services office. That's obviously a different discussion that you guys had yesterday.
Mr. Band?
Yes, I just wanted to add that in the existing, the chapeau, as it were, of the existing regulation for exemptions, it basically says, shall not apply, the prohibition shall not apply to people who engage in non-infringing uses of the following classes of works. I mean, so that's always there. That's always there as a backstop, and even in the context of the market and the possibility of a market, well, the truth is that if somehow one of these uses is harming the market for a work, again, in that highly unlikely hypothetical situation, well, it might not be a fair use, right? In that case, if I do decide that I'm going to closed caption Wonder Woman, I don't know why, but if I decide to and that somehow harms the market, well, then it's not a fair use, and I'm an infringer. But all of this goes to what we were talking about yesterday. Our goal is to sort of keep the exemption as simple as possible, as streamlined as possible, so that people out in the field can say, yeah, okay, I can use this, and not have 14 steps, and they say, well, do I meet this one? Do I meet this one? Do I meet this one? That's the point, is to really make sure that the students who need the help get it.
And I know we don't want to belabor the market point, but I just wanted to throw in one more point. Universities are actively engaged in trying to encourage a market for these works. So, for example, the University of Colorado, where I'm on the faculty, is in a settlement with the Department of Justice about inaccessible versions of its video materials, among other things, and has a working group across campus that tries to promote the acquisition of accessible materials and highlight publishers that make, for example, textbooks available accessibly. So this is an effort for universities because it's consistent with their educational mission. It's consistent with their efforts to lower tuition, to make the process streamlined for everyone. So where the market can step in, we are all about that, and we are excited about that. We are here because we're not there, if that makes any sense.
If I can ask a question, if I might, just to follow up a little bit on what we're talking about. If a student were to come into the Disabilities Rights Office and they said, I have a video for this, I would like you to make it accessible. Is that something that you would do? That seems to be a lawfully acquired copy. Would you do it just for personal use for a student?
So the way that our office works, that if we have met with the student and we determine their accommodations using an interactive case-by-case process, and we discover that they are eligible for the closed captioning, if it's content that they need for their course, then we would go ahead and caption that.
But to more pointedly answer your question, if it's a student says, I bought this video and I want to go watch it this weekend with my buddies, that's not something a disability services office is ever going to do. This is in an educational context.
So that's one of the caveats here. And to follow up, the same with the professor. If the professor comes in and said, I would like to review this, I may or may not use it in a course, is that one of the things you would ask as well? If you intend to use it in a course, that limits what we're going to do. If you're going to use it for personal use, then you wouldn't allow it. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And I think, moreover, someone that works at a state university, if we were faculty members who were showing up at Disability Services offices asking for the service, we would get a lot of questions about abuse of public funding and that sort of thing. So I think the punchline is, if the office is so inclined to put some limitation in the exemption that scopes it to educational purposes or purposes related to the functioning of a library in a way that's broad enough as to not generate a lot of ambiguities, I don't think we would have a problem with that.
Here's another question related to that. So the language you've suggested is, and I think then we want to go into the types of institutions that might be able to make use of an exemption, but you've listed, X types of institutions who have legal and ethical obligations to make works accessible. Would another way of sort of closing that loop say the circumvention is allowed in fulfillment of those legal and ethical obligations?
Yeah, and just on having not thought hard about that formulation, I think that makes sense, and I don't think we're contemplating scenarios where, well, here's I think the one rub with that is if a university is choosing to go above and beyond its obligations under the ADA, that might be a scenario where we would still want to be able to circumvent. And I think the case law is developing in the ADA context, so we wouldn't want to foreclose that line of inquiry. So I think talking about for accessibility purposes in an educational or library context, probably a safer formulation from our perspective. But I'm having a little bit of trouble identifying an example of the difference between that and what you just suggested. So.
Okay, I appreciate that because I, listened to Mr. Band and I'm not trying to create a 14, point checklist, but just thinking if that's what you've tied it to originally, maybe that just sort of says for the purposes of why you've gotten in the door in the first place.
If I could probe a
and
little
if
bit.
Educational uses, you think, or library uses would do the same, that would be good to understand too.
I mean, one other thing I might throw in for your consideration is that there are some universities that have raised the presence of copyright law as a barrier to their compliance with ADA. So we probably would like to avoid a circularity where we say, is the university obliged? Well, that depends on copyright law. Copyright law asks whether the university is obliged, and then we don't have a way to break that circularity. We're obviously of the position that the universities ought to be doing this, and that it ought to be consistent with copyright law. So I might ponder that circularity a little bit.
If I could probe a little bit more, some of the universities now are expanding their reach, not just on campus use or students that are local but are remote or online classes. Can you speak a little bit about how this exemption might work there for students that might come to the Disabilities Rights Office and ask for accessibility of videos that might be included in a remote or online course?
Sure, that's a great question and something else that we're grappling with for online course development. So Kent State University implemented an EIT policy that asks that we have.
What's EIT?
I'm sorry, Electronic Information Technology. So we are trying to do proactive accessibility more in a universal design approach so that when a student registers in August for courses and is taking an online course, the course is ready to go and it is captioned.
In those cases, would it often include some of the content that we're talking about today, either in clips or in full, larger versions of the video or other type content? Is that included in those online videos?
Lawfully obtained videos.
In the online content that you're offering in courses?
Correct. So not all of the, currently just the example again at Kent State University, not all video content is being captioned, but there is a push to be ready to have that proactive, accessible content ready to go. Should someone needing that accommodation sign up for online courses, it would be accessible.
And if I could just, again, encourage punting the contours of the complexities of distance education and MOOCs and all of that sort of stuff to the other contexts where this office and courts have been considering those issues and not importing that into making a disability services office make a determination about whether the subsequent use of the video itself or the intake of the video is lawful. Again, we understand that there are limitations on what's acceptable in that context, but we don't want the disability services folks to have to be in the business of redoing that analysis, if that makes any sense.
Thank you. That's all really helpful. I think we're going to turn a little bit to kind of just defining the class of users. So the examples that are in the record are typically examples of students at universities seeking accessible formats. So when you list out the different kind of potential users, you have disability services offices, organizations that support people with disabilities, libraries, and other units at educational institutions. So are we really just talking about entities within a university? So we're not talking about like libraries outside of universities, I guess is what I kind of want to focus on what we're really trying to do here.
but I'm looking to Carrie Russell from ALA to, let me consult with her, and then if we can come back to that.
If you want to do that, I can respond to one piece of that question, which is within the university, the reason we tried to draw that formulation in a fairly broad way is because different universities have different configurations of where the locus of disability services is. So, for example, there are some universities with a fairly elaborate quote-unquote disability services office. In other universities, like at the University of Colorado, we've got a disability services office that's responsible with coordinating with the main campus's information technology department and some academic units for the rendering of disability services. So we wanted to make sure that we didn't draw the exemption in a way where some university has to look at it and say, are we a quote-unquote disability services office, or do we have some configuration that's not permitted?
Understood. So just the upshot, though, is that ultimately, like, what you hope to get out of this exemption is that students at universities are able to, regardless of where they get it within the university, wherever they get the accessible format, but that they're really the ultimate, I don't want to say end user, but they are the ultimate beneficiary of this exemption.
I think that's right, and it's also worth emphasizing we drew the exemption in or at least the proposed language in a broad enough way that it might encompass K through 12 institutions. We obviously didn't have a significant support on the record for that. We are hearing rumblings that is of interest, that the need to caption videos in K through 12 institutions is additionally coming up. So I might throw that out there as well. But to your formulation about the university, I think from our perspective that's correct, but Mr. Bannon may have more to say.
So I just clarified, and thanks for indulging me. So, obviously in a perfect world, the exemption would apply to libraries making it for any library user who needs it. But as a practical matter, the real need is in the educational context, but not only in higher ed, meaning also K-12. So the K-12 libraries need to support students who have hearing disabilities, so they have that need as well. Now again, it's a smaller universe. You don't have the diversity of content and so forth, but it does happen in the K-12 context too. So it's but again, it really is all about education at this point. That is the highest priority, and a good place to start.
So it would be fair to say units at nonprofit educational institutions. I sort of added the word nonprofit, which is in the Chafee amendment, as like an analogy, but just to understand based on what you've submitted, that we understand where you think the need
now that
is.
Trump University is closed, I suppose, yeah, we could do that.
I'll let that one lie. We might mention that limitation. The Chafee Amendment is not necessarily a limitation of federal accessibility law. So for-profit colleges, for example, that take federal funding are going to be subject to these same obligations under the Rehab Act. So I might be a little anxious about adding that nonprofit qualifier. There may be contexts in which a for-profit college needs to do it. One other very minor clarification, since we're talking about entities and scope, just to make sure. There are some scenarios where a disability services office is going to be doing the captioning in-house. There are other situations where they're going to be working with a captioning vendor in contractual privity and basically saying, here, you caption this video and bring it back. So there's going to be strong contractual ties between the Disability Services Office and the vendor, but we just want to make sure that that's part of the record here, that that's also a scenario that unfolds. And just to assuage any concerns that might come up about that, these are the same captioning vendors that the movie studios and television broadcasters and everybody else hires, and they have very strict confidentiality agreements and don't disseminate videos and all of that sort of stuff. But that's a pretty regular part of this universe, and I think the same goes true for the description part of the world as well.
So, because the language Ms. Smith was talking about, either like a nonprofit organization or a governmental agency. That's taken from Section 121 of the Copyright Act, which has been incorporated into the existing temporary exemption for assistive technologies and ebooks. So if we're not going to use that because you don't feel comfortable that it would include for-profit universities, so do you, rather than kind of listing out, I just don't know if listing out, I mean, especially when you say other units at educational institutions, that might, I think or the opponents thought that was a little bit too broad. So do you have perhaps a better way of maybe more broadly collapsing these different kind of units or different entities within an organization or within a university?
Am I to take from the question that units within an educational institution is an overly broad construction from the office's
that could
perspective?
include the cafeteria. I mean, I don't know what a unit at a university means, and maybe that's something we can talk about more in like post-hearing discussions because it's going more towards regulatory language. But just because the opponents are not here today, one of their concerns was that they felt that the list of proposed users was overly broad. So I just wanted to address that concern to see if you had thought of a different way or a narrower way to define those users.
And maybe another way is it started off saying disability services offices and then started to be like maybe a catch-all in case something doesn't technically qualify. But if that might be a way the office could clarify in guidance that it is something like a disability services office.
I mean, I think you might, maybe you could qualify it by the activity or purpose of the unit. So disability services office or other unit engaged in the provision of accessibility services within the university or something like that. And I think we'd be happy to stipulate that in most cases the cafeteria is not included in that list.
I think one of the things that we were grappling with during our research is in talking to several universities and disability services offices at universities around the country. Every university has a very specific and individual chain of distribution and how they handle these things. So we've been very reluctant to narrow this exemption in a way that where some universities can't benefit. And I think this goes back to our initial conversation we were having about market and sources and sourcing and legally acquired. We want to minimize the burden on disability services offices. Really, we want them to be able to do their job in the most efficient and effective way possible. And to try and make them consider, are we, like, where do we fit? Do we fit under this exemption is something that we want to avoid.
No, understood. And I just wanted to turn back to something Mr. Band had acknowledged, like K through 12. This could be, obviously making accessible formats, doesn't apply just to universities. But then Mr. Reed also acknowledged that, at least for the record, for the purposes of this rulemaking, that the examples are limited basically to the university context. So because we have to rely on concrete examples in evaluating whether or not an exemption should be recommended, would it be reasonable then to just look at the university context since that is the record at hand?
So, I mean, we've urged the office in the past, and this may be a losing battle, so I won't belabor it. We think Section 1201 doesn't ask the office to set up proponents and opponents. It delegates to you the obligation to do a rulemaking into which you ought to do some sua sponte investigation of that question. So, in other words, I don't like the idea that the office says we haven't had anyone show up to ask for this in very specific terms, so therefore there is no adverse effect. We'd encourage you to investigate that question, but the scope of resources that we had to dedicate to this was primarily focused on universities, and that's what we were able to come up with.
We also encourage you to support the Copyright Office having adequate resources to serve this rulemaking as well as its other functions. I mean, we are dependent upon participants in the rulemaking in large part to provide us with information as well as a matter of sort of fairness so that everyone can understand the issues to be aired for that.
Right, but I would just amplify Blake's point about, what is, and I know this is, we've had this conversation about what is it, what is the nature of this proceeding? But it is a rulemaking. It's not an adjudication.
Correct.
Right. It doesn't. There's nowhere in here in the statute. It doesn't talk about evidence. But there obviously a rulemaking has to be based on a record, and there is. There's certainly the concrete examples have been given in the higher ed context, but there are the same issues existing in the K-12 context, and I'm presenting right now evidence to that effect. I can't give you specific titles, but it is clear that the K-12 institutions have an obligation under the ADA to make this stuff available, and that is, obviously part of the record too. And so, it certainly seems to me that it's well within the scope of your authority to say that the exemption can apply to educational institutions at any level that need to provide access to their students.
If I can ask a question there, just to probe a little bit on this, and I know you probably didn't ask, but do K through 12 schools frequently come for this sort of service, either to a university for assistance or to one of these captioning companies to ask for the captioning services for titles that they may have? Do you know of any that have done that?
So the university wouldn't be equipped to caption videos for K through 12 setting. There are times where I'm called upon to consult with, to ask what business we use. We outsource a lot of our video because in the video that I showed today, it was just 1 minute long. So the rate out there for an hour of video, it takes roughly 7 hours of labor. So we do a lot of outsourcing. So I am consulted with in public schools. I've also worked for public schools before as a sign language interpreter where there are videos shown. And we would expect that the deaf and hard of hearing students are attending K through 12 before they even are able to see us at the university setting. So long as teachers are using video, it would need to be captioned.
So in the K through 12 setting, though, how would teachers accomplish that without the resources that exist at the university that have this separate office to deal with these things?
So the K through 12 setting would need to abide by that IDA, and their students are also on IEPs. So they would use their resources similar to the universities use our resources in order to provide accommodations, including the captioning content. So.
And I think it's probably worth underscoring too here, saying why have we not surfaced these issues before? We're seeing a convergence of a few things. One is the increased use of video content in classrooms. I don't know if folks saw the Apple education event a couple of weeks ago. I think it's a fairly good demonstration of the expectation that a modern student, even in a K through 12 context, is going to be engaging with multimedia content in a way that even 10 years ago it wasn't the case. I think you are also seeing an increased amount of litigation in the disability rights side of things to actually vindicate these rights that have been sitting in the IDA and the ADA and the Rehab Act. So the question is, do all K through 12 schools have the resources to support that? The answer is not yet, but it's a big question in disability policy. The answer is not like, well, too bad. The students in those situations are out of luck. Folks are increasingly trying to think about how do we get around that? How do we find the resources to support that? And what we are trying to get at here is we don't want for the next 3 years the DMCA to be lurking out there as we got to wait another 3 years to fix this if we figure out a way to bend the cost curves and make it right. And that'd be a shame to make that a barrier for K through 12 schools.
Just in the interest, I don't know, Ms. Collins, did you have anything specific to add to that, or?
I just would like to add that in the K through 12 setting, you're dealing with deaf education teachers and also special ed teachers. So they're the stopgap. They're able to look for and provide accessible content, but in the higher ed setting, the faculty, their expertise is not necessarily in disability. It's our responsibility to be able to provide that accommodation.
Just to follow up on that, just a touch, if I might. In a school system, maybe not in a school, is there not a pooling of resources? In other words, in the school system within a district, don't they often have a pool of individuals that can help with those sorts of plans for individuals that have specific learning plans in the schools, and then to bring in somebody to assist with the disability learning? Is that, you know, if that's available?
Absolutely. So, I mean, so in Montgomery County, you would, you know, here in Maryland, you would, you know, as Ms. Cowling said, I mean, you would certainly, first in the school, you would have specialists, and that sort of is different from the higher ed context. But then you also have a district-wide office, a disability services office, and that you do have the pooling of resources. And I imagine, to the extent that there needs to be a video caption, that it would sort of go through the people in that office. It probably wouldn't be done on the individual elementary school level, that it would be done on a countywide basis, because they would typically have a countywide curriculum, and there would be that kind of pooling of resources.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful. Just in the interest of time, I wanted to move just a little bit. In the proposed regulatory language, there's the term people with disabilities. Would it be reasonable to use the Department of Education's regulations implementing the IDEA as a guide to define that term?
I believe IDA is K through 12, so that might not be the
Okay.
ideal.
So like the ADA, like, is there maybe like a specific, just like, for example, you have the ebooks exemption with assistive services. It goes back to section 121, but that only covers people with relating to, it doesn't include people with hearing impairments, which obviously would want to be included. So I think, and again, if you don't have it now, but just thinking like what should we use as a guide to define that term?
I think the ADA is probably the right place to pull that term, but we'd welcome the opportunity to follow up with some specific briefing on this point if it's of interest to the office, just to make sure we cite you the right chapter and verse of the right law. I think there is probably a construction in either the Department of Justice's regulations or the ADA itself that is the broader version of what you are looking for from the Chafee Amendment, but I don't have that right at hand, and I don't want to tell you the wrong thing, so we'd welcome the opportunity to follow up on that.
Okay. So we've talked a little bit about like circumvention methods. So when you're out, because you also talk about, obviously we have the demonstration if you are doing it yourselves, but if you outsource it and you have a third party, so I guess vendors do both audio description and captioning? Okay.
Correct.
And then what format is it typically received in from the vendor?
Yeah, so that would be the same format in the demonstration. So typically MP4 format
Okay.
or audio MP3.
And does the vendor place any TPMs on the accessible version before it's sent to you?
No, I don't think that's generally the case. Again, as I mentioned, the contractual arrangements with vendors are usually, again, because they work with copyright holders and studios and television studios on this kind of work. They are generally contractually prohibited from doing anything that would use their possession of a video as piracy. And you can imagine they do TV shows that are coming out wide, they do movies that are going to be in theaters and all of that kind of stuff. So these guys are pros at that.
And then when you're outsourcing to outside vendors, are you typically going to like DVDs and Blu-ray and circumventing that and then sending them the MP3 files for those types of, or are we also talking about going to an internet streaming service and having them, I guess I'm just trying to understand when are they used versus what you guys do yourself?
Let me make clear that this is prospective in nature, but ideally, I think what would happen under the proposed exemption would be that the Disability Services Office would be able to do the circumvention. So I don't think we need to get down the rabbit hole of can the third party do the circumvention? I think the idea is the Disability Services Office would be doing that. Is that fair?
Thank you, that's helpful. So just a little bit more about the dissemination of the work. So we've talked a little bit about that. In the reply comments, it states, so once the media is captioned or audio described, disability services professionals then deliver the newly accessible media to the requesting student in the same way that content is distributed to non-disabled students. So what specifically does that mean?
Sure, so this speaks to if the course is online and the video content is already being housed in, for this example, Blackboard Learn. So the video that's in Kaltura, now the time text file, the captioning file is added in Kaltura, and that link or embed code is in Blackboard.
So that's very helpful. So what if a DVD is used in a class? So we're kind of out of the Kaltura context. So would a student who needs an accessible format, would they be given a DVD containing the accessible format if that's what is used in the classroom?
We would like that the students with that accommodation are able to view in the same way that a student without an accommodation. So if the class is watching the DVD in the classroom and it's using a projector with whatever DVD or MP4 file, as we showed today, we're able to download the MP4, that the student would watch it in the same manner at the same time to have that equal access.
So just to clarify, I think the Kaltura and Blackboard situation is a situation where it might be homework assigned for a student to watch, as in thinking about a flipped classroom situation where a student's got to watch a video. Obviously, in a classroom situation, there might not be a need to distribute it, and it might be burned onto a DVD or something along those lines.
But if the DVD is maybe not being shown in class, if it's, you just go out and watch this, I'm clarifying to know, is the accessible version, would that be given to the student on a DVD, or is it pretty much controlled only from the university?
Sure, so I can't think in all of my years of working in higher ed that I've ever distributed a DVD to a student. It would be password protected within Kaltura streamed.
So I think one related issue is thinking about this in a parallel to the current ebooks exemption, which says the use will be, I guess, in accordance or pursuant to 121, which has restrictions on the further distribution of copies, and also thinking about there's been a bill introduced to implement the Marrakesh Treaty, which would have a number of practices, the authorizing entity or the circumventing entity by way of parallel. Would it be reasonable to have them follow a series of practices to prevent further reproduction or distribution beyond the scope of the use that is intended?
I think Mr. Band probably has something to say on this front as well. I think in this context, you have got the backdrop of we've got to have non-infringing uses, and there's nothing concrete on the record to suggest that there are any serious concerns about redistribution. I think we've tried to reassure you in our comments and today that is not the purpose of this exemption, and the copyright holders, if someone were to try to leverage this exemption in some untoward way, have got numerous sorts of backdrops, not limited to all of their Section 106 rights that are potentially being infringed. So I think the expectation, again, is that this exemption is not being used in the situation that is contemplated in Marrakesh and 121, in particular because in Marrakesh and 121, there's a new copy being created of the work that is potentially going with the person, right? It might be a large format book, might be a Braille version of a book, and something, there's something to sort of grapple with there that is not, I don't think, the case in this situation.
Yeah, I'll just add that in the Marrakesh context, certainly with the proposed 121A, We're talking about international distribution, and that's why you have the additional safeguards. I mean, this is not what we're talking about here. And also, even in terms of the exemptions you've granted in the past, the MOOC exemption, again, is contemplating much broader dissemination than what we're talking about. We're talking about sort of to students within the campus. We're not talking about reaching across the country, or again, with MOOCs around the world. That's not what we're looking for. And so because of that, again, additional restrictions and requirements, maybe it will be items 9 through 14 on the checklist. I mean, just not, it's not necessary, and it just would deter use of the exemption. And that's, again, the goal is to help the students as much as possible and to make it as easy as possible to do that.
Just to follow up on your reference to international versus domestic dissemination, so you do have section 110.2, which granted is for distance education, which may or may not apply to the circumstances of this exemption, but it definitely deals with domestic distribution. It's like talking about any kind of dissemination, and Congress wanted that to basically reduce the likelihood of downstream piracy. So there is some evidence, at least in the educational context, for Congress wanting to put some type of safeguard in. So I think our question is, would that be reasonable to do that here if it's done in other educational contexts?
Well, again, a lot of it, I guess it all depends on, and I know this is an issue that's ongoing, what is distance ed? When is something 110.1 or 110.2? And I think certainly my understanding is that many universities sort of in their minds, I mean, distance ed is when it's entirely a distance ed class, whereas you now have more and more blended classes, or where it's basically an in-class, face-to-face instruction, but that you have certain aspects of it that do occur online, and much of it is streaming of material, or it could be chats and so forth. That is seen typically as all 110.1 as opposed to 110.1 and 110.2. I mean, that's, I think, as a practical matter, how people are treating it.
Sure. I think it was more just the acknowledgement that Congress has shown some inclination to add safeguards in a domestic context for further dissemination. So I guess, would it be reasonable so that the reproduction or distribution under the proposed exemption would be exclusively for use by person with disabilities, if we're not going to maybe put all this kind of the safeguards of, like, for example, section 110.2 protections? Would it at least be reasonable to cap it with, like, this has to be for, exclusive use for people
Right. Well,
with disabilities?
the only problem I could see with that, and I imagine the people who really know it would add to that, is that I can imagine a situation where the professor might say, okay, we're going to add the closed captioning for, one student, but, when we're going to show the clip in the classroom, it's going to be seen by all students. I mean, the caption is there really for one, but it's not like they're going to have two split screens, right, where, everyone's looking in this direction, but the hard of hearing student is looking in that direction.
Sure.
It's
Well,
not
I
going to
guess
work that way.
Understood
so-
and appreciated. I think, but the circumvention would be done exclusively for the purposes of people
Right,
with
the
right, so-
circumvention is done, but it will be
because you're
conceivably
talking about
made
the
available.
performance, like the
Yeah,
performance is not
performance,
just
right,
for
right.
individuals with disabilities, but I guess, would it be reasonable to limit the circumvention for purposes of providing access for people with disabilities
Right,
somehow?
but
kind of
I
putting
was
that-
thinking it would just need to be worded carefully so that it doesn't inadvertently end up in a situation where, a professor can not show it to the entire class, and thereby, basically, again, make the students feel excluded. And the whole idea here is to make everyone be included.
And I just add the comment that I added, I think, in the two earlier hearings this week, which is keeping these exemptions simple and avoiding using this exemption process as a means to impose a complicated regulatory regime on the use of circumvented video. Obviously, Congress saw fit to do that in Section 110 with the benefit of a lot further deliberation. This is not something that's present in the record. So again, if the office is inclined to go down this road in a very steep way, we'd welcome the opportunity to comment further. Just to preserve that.
If I could follow up a little bit too, it seems we have another category here. We've talked about libraries. Libraries tend to serve individuals that come in. We've been talking about sort of university libraries, but are we including public libraries in that category? And they seem to have a different clientele, right? I can't imagine, I haven't seen it, but a section of the library wall that includes DVDs to be checked out. That would be a distribution problem in some ways if somebody were to take that DVD home and then, further distribute it from their home. Is that an issue in this particular process as well?
Well, as I mentioned before, at this point, I mean, maybe next time, but at this point, we're not looking for an exemption for public libraries to to make accessible copies for, the hearing disabled people who are just coming in to, want to check something out for their own pleasure. I mean, that at this point, it's entirely looking at the educational context. But let me just add that I know we've been talking about just education. I imagine it probably, we should think about making it research and education, because I would imagine conceivably you might have to have, it just occurred to me, but there might be a hard of hearing professor who's doing research and would want that, but I'm not.
And I think the way to deal with that is we talked earlier about scoping the entities that are involved in that, and that's why we're talking about within the context of an educational institution as being kind of the right locus.
All right, well, thank you very much. We appreciate all of your comments, and we're going to look at them carefully. I don't think that we have any more questions, so we will do something unique and wrap up a little bit early and come back at 11:30 to discuss jailbreaking. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.